On the night of May 17th, 2023, Ariel Voss left the Granite, a boutique hotel and event venue nestled in downtown Phoenix. The mood inside had been upbeat, drinks were flowing, soft jazz played in the background, and the guest list included influencers, buyers, and local fashion elites. Ariel had shown up late but radiant, wearing a muted black jumpsuit of her own design. She'd been working non-stop on her upcoming fall line and told a colleague this event was a much-needed break, a chance to reconnect with people who mattered in the industry. At 10:38 p.m., she politely excused herself from a conversation, walked past the front desk, and stepped into the elevator toward the parking garage below. 4 minutes later, she was captured on security footage entering the dimly lit garage on foot, alone, clutching her phone in one hand and her keys in the other. She passed 2 parked cars, reached the second level where her gray Lexus sedan was stationed, and then nothing. There were no further images, no confirmed sightings, no witnesses. That was the last time anyone saw her. The following morning, Ariel missed a 9 a.m. Zoom call with a textile supplier. Her assistant, concerned, texted twice, then called. No response. By noon, the assistant drove to Ariel's apartment where her car wasn't parked. She wasn't inside either. The bed hadn't been slept in. Her laptop, water bottle, and daily planner still sat on the dining room table. At 2:15 p.m., she was reported missing. Detectives began with the logical starting point, her last known location. The parking structure beneath the Granite had 12 security cameras positioned at various angles across 3 levels. Ariel's entry was clear, but just as she reached her parking spot, the camera closest to her cut to black. It would later be revealed that the feed had gone dark for a window of exactly 4 minutes. Ariel is seen walking toward her car at 10:42 p.m. By 10:46, when the camera reactivates, the frame is empty. Her vehicle was located in its assigned space, keys still in her bag inside. The doors were locked. The interior was undisturbed. No broken glass, no signs of a struggle. Her phone, which last pinged inside the garage at 10:44 p.m., had either been turned off or destroyed. Location tracking ended there. Police initially categorized the situation as a delayed response missing person. Ariel was an adult, no signs of violence, no known threats. Maybe she left voluntarily, they said. Maybe she'd simply needed to get away. But her family knew better. Ariel had never just disappeared. She was meticulous, regimented, and always in communication. She lived by her calendar. Every meeting, every deadline, every errand was logged. She'd recently been on the cusp of securing a licensing deal with a high-end retailer. Her collection was set to debut in 3 months. Her career was accelerating, fast. She wouldn't just vanish on the brink of a breakthrough. The more detectives looked, the stranger the case became. There were no witnesses. No audio was caught on the building's mic system. No footsteps, screams, or echoes. No strange vehicles entered or exited during the 10-minute window that Ariel went missing. Her car key fob had not unlocked the vehicle. Her face never appeared on footage from any stairwell, elevator, or exit ramp. She had simply ceased to exist somewhere between one step and the next. The Phoenix PD brought in digital forensics teams to analyze Ariel's devices. Her phone was unrecoverable. Her laptop and external drives were untouched. No suspicious emails, no drafts or journal entries indicating mental distress or plans to leave. But something was missing. Her current sketchbook, a leather-bound journal she carried religiously, was nowhere to be found. Detectives canvassed the area, flyers went up, tips came in, all dead ends. Someone thought they saw her at a gas station in Flagstaff. Someone else claimed she was in a rehab facility under a fake name. Both were false. Volunteers searched nearby canals, desert edges, and construction sites. Nothing turned up. The case stalled after 2 weeks, then a month, then 3. Public interest waned, but inside the Voss family, the grief only intensified. Her parents stopped doing interviews. Her older sister, Caroline, started sleeping in Ariel's apartment. The assistant left the city altogether. She couldn't handle the silence, she later said. Couldn't keep seeing that empty parking spot every time she closed her eyes. Despite no evidence of foul play, something felt inherently wrong. as if whatever had happened to Ariel Voss wasn't impulsive. It was organized, clean, cold. The absence of evidence was its kind of fingerprint. Detectives held a press conference exactly 90 days later, urging the public for help. But there was no new information, just the same facts, repeated, slightly more desperate this time. And still, no sign of Ariel, until almost 2 years later, when a burned scrap of her work turned up in a pile of trash and cracked open everything they thought they knew. In the days following Ariel Voss's disappearance, detectives turned their attention to her world, a tightly wound orbit of sketchbooks, studio lighting, late nights, and silent ambition. At 32, Ariel was entering the next tier of her career. After nearly a decade designing under other people's names, she had finally broken through with her label. Her work was bold but wearable. Known for its severe angles and unconventional textures, she wasn't mainstream, but she was rising. Several boutique fashion houses had started circling, and more than one luxury reseller had expressed interest in licensing her fall collection. Ariel had spent months on it. That line was going to be her signature, her fingerprint on the industry. Detectives interviewed friends, co-workers, and clients. They painted a picture of someone in a constant state of movement. Ariel had been working 10 to 12-hour days, 6 days a week. She rarely socialized outside industry events. Her inner circle was small. Her clients were loyal, sometimes fiercely so, but she didn't trust easily. One close friend said she'd become noticeably different in the months leading up to her disappearance. Not erratic, just quieter, more tense. She'd started carrying her latest sketchbook with her everywhere, even to dinners. It never left her side. That same friend remembered a conversation where Ariel admitted she thought someone was watching her, or at least her work. She didn't name anyone specific, just said she knew when someone was copying, and this time it felt closer. She had reason to worry. Ariel's designs were gaining attention in a space that often blurs inspiration with theft. Several Instagram accounts had recently reposted her work without credit. One anonymous user messaged her directly, saying they had access to her next line before she'd published anything. Ariel didn't respond publicly, but she screenshotted the message and shared it with her assistant, writing, "Am I being paranoid?" It was more than paranoia. A week before she vanished, Ariel canceled her public preview showcase, a high-stakes event where she was set to unveil her new collection to private buyers. According to her assistant, Ariel sent a text at 2:11 a.m. the night before. "It doesn't feel safe. Pull the venue. Send apologies." She didn't elaborate further. That was the first and only time she'd ever pulled out of a confirmed event. When detectives searched Ariel's apartment, they found it undisturbed. Her keys and purse had been recovered from her car, but everything else appeared untouched. The space was clinical, not cold but controlled. Her work table was neatly arranged, fabric swatches labeled by hand, needles magnetized to a steel dish, and her backup sketchbooks lined in chronological order. But her current one, the one she was using at the time of her disappearance, was gone. Her assistant confirmed she hadn't seen any differences at the event. There were no signs of forced entry. No valuables were missing. Her passport and credit cards were untouched. Her browser history showed recent searches for textile wholesalers, appointment bookings, and garment dye techniques. Nothing alarming. Her fridge held a few takeout containers and a half-full bottle of kombucha. The only detail that gave investigators pause was the thermostat. It had been manually set to 60 degrees, the lowest setting, something no one who knew her could explain. As the team dug deeper into Ariel's business contacts, they found more tension beneath the surface. An early investor, a silent partner with a background in tech, had recently pulled out of a pending licensing deal, citing creative differences. He refused to elaborate when questioned by police. Another designer, one who had previously interned under Ariel, had released a line with eerily similar features 3 months earlier. When confronted, she claimed it was a coincidence. Ariel, however, had privately told a friend she believed that intern had accessed her private drive. She never reported it. Not to police, not even to her legal counsel. Just moved on, worked harder, kept the sketchbook closer. Detectives began to weigh possibilities. The psychological profile leaned toward burnout. The hours, the pressure, the weight of building something from nothing. Maybe she'd had a breakdown, maybe she'd walked away. But nothing about her life suggested that. She had meetings scheduled, emails drafted, rent paid for 6 months in advance, a full client roster, and that missing notebook, the one physical item that hadn't been found anywhere. It mattered more than they first understood. It didn't just contain her drawings. It contained the entire unreleased collection. Measurements, sourcing information, and production timelines. Intellectual property worth potentially tens of thousands, if not more. When they pulled security footage from her studio, a small converted loft she used a few days a week, they found no evidence of anyone following her. No one had broken in. But the building manager told detectives that 2 weeks earlier, a man had come by asking for her. Tall, mid-30s. He said he was a supplier from L.A. Ariel wasn't in. He didn't leave a name. He never returned. There was no security camera facing the door, no fingerprints, no name, no sketchbook, and no Ariel. As the first week passed, her inner circle fractured. Some believed she had been targeted. Others thought she had broken under pressure. But none could explain how a woman so deliberate, so organized, so close to finally achieving everything she'd worked for, could just vanish without leaving behind a single trace. And then, investigators reviewed the garage footage one more time and noticed what they had missed the first time. A moment so subtle it hadn't registered as anything suspicious. But once they saw it, they couldn't unsee it. When detectives revisited the parking garage surveillance footage for the third time, it wasn't to confirm what was there, but to study what wasn't. The entire structure was covered by 12 cameras, most of them fixed at angles, positioned to capture entry points, vehicle movement, and pedestrian flow across all 3 levels. Ariel Voss was seen on 4 of those cameras that night. She entered the elevator alone at 10:39 p.m., descended to level 2, and exited toward her car. On camera 6, she's visible walking with purpose, clutching her phone, keys in hand. At 10:42 p.m., she rounds the corner into the view of camera 9, the one facing her assigned parking spot, and pauses near the rear bumper of her Lexus. Then, without warning, the feed cuts to black. At first, investigators assumed a failure, technical failure, power surge, connectivity issue, routine corruption. But a forensic analysis of the digital video recorder revealed something much more intentional. The data wasn't corrupted, it was wiped. Precisely 4 minutes of footage, deleted from one camera only, leaving the others intact. The DVR system required admin credentials to alter or remove footage. The log showed no authorized access during that time. Whoever erased it either bypassed the system entirely or had inside knowledge of how to disable the recording without leaving a trace. The tech team couldn't even determine if the data had been removed remotely or on site. All they knew for certain was that someone had gone out of their way to make sure no one ever saw what happened between 10:42 and 10:46 p.m. In the remaining frames, Ariel's last visible moments play out with a disturbing kind of stillness. She steps to the passenger side of her car, glances over her shoulder, then turns and walks slightly out of frame behind a structural pillar. From that point on, she never reappears. Not in the background. Not reflected in any neighboring 911 and windows. She doesn't open her car, doesn't run, doesn't fall. It's as if she walked into a blind spot and simply stopped existing. No one else enters the frame. No other shadows move. The surrounding cars remain still. For the next 8 hours, until maintenance staff begin arriving around 6 a.m., nothing changes in that garage. Detectives pulled building access logs. No key fob entries were recorded during that 4-minute window. No vehicle entered or exited the garage. There were no sounds reported, no calls placed to 911, and no complaints filed about suspicious activity. The entire building had gone silent during the exact window when Ariel disappeared. A detailed sweep of the structure found no blood, no torn clothing, and no physical evidence of any kind. A cadaver dog was brought in 36 hours later. It showed slight interest in a corner near a maintenance closet, but no remains, traces, or scent trails were located. That closet had been locked. Inside were janitorial supplies and a utility sink. Nothing suspicious. Investigators began interviewing building staff and tenants. Most had gone home well before 10 p.m. The concierge on duty that night recalled seeing Ariel pass through the lobby. He said she looked normal, focused, said she nodded, but one didn't stop to talk. He also mentioned something strange, that the parking garage lights on level 2 had briefly gone dim around the same time. The timers were set to auto-adjust, but he remembered seeing a flicker on the monitor, like someone had cut the circuit briefly and turned it back on. He didn't think much of it at the time. Electrical inspections showed no evidence of tampering, but building security logs showed that 2 motion sensors on that level failed to activate during that 4-minute gap. Those sensors, installed near the stairwell and utility room, had never malfunctioned in the 3 years since installation. All other cameras functioned normally that night. No footage was missing anywhere else in the garage. Just camera 9. Just those 4 minutes. Detectives began considering whether someone had been waiting for her. Ariel was a creature of habit. Those who knew her said she often parked in the same space. She almost always left through the garage and rarely used the front valet. She disliked attention, preferred control. If someone had been tracking her, either digitally or physically, they would have known exactly where she'd be that night and roughly when she'd leave. The networking event had been posted publicly. Her name was on the flyer. The venue was predictable. The route from the event space to the parking garage took less than 2 minutes. Still, without footage, the theories stayed theories. One detective remarked that it was the cleanest disappearance he'd ever seen. Too clean. No one sees her being taken. No one hears her scream. No digital trail. No physical residue. Just a clean, silent pocket of time where nothing and everything happened at once. They brought in a private data consultant to see if the missing footage could be recovered from deep backups. The answer was no. The drive had been overwritten multiple times. Whatever was lost was gone permanently. And whoever deleted it knew exactly how much time they needed. 4 minutes. The case shifted from a missing person to a possible abduction. But without evidence of a crime, no charges could be filed, no arrests made, and no warrants issued. Ariel was still just a missing woman with a missing sketchbook and a missing 4 minutes that refused to give up their secrets. And then something else emerged. A small clue buried in a digital archive from a month prior, one that no one had noticed during the initial review. A clue that might explain why she was so afraid of someone copying her work, and who that someone might have been. As the physical evidence dried up, detectives turned to the people who knew Ariel, or at least claimed to. They started with the obvious names: her assistant, her ex-boyfriend, a private investor, and a sister she hadn't spoken to in over a year. What they found was a pattern of people who all played roles in her life, but offered very little insight into who she was in those final days. When questioned, they shared fragments, contradictions, and vague recollections, and none of them had a verifiable alibi for the night she vanished. Her assistant, Naomi Blake, had worked with her for nearly 2 years. She handled scheduling and client coordination and occasionally helped prepare mood boards for new collections. Naomi told detectives she had left town that evening to visit her parents in Sedona, a 3-hour drive from Phoenix. She claimed she didn't hear about Ariel's disappearance until the next afternoon, when a mutual contact called her in a panic. When asked to confirm her location, Naomi said her phone died during the drive, and she hadn't used her debit card until late the next morning when she stopped for gas on the way back. There were no toll booths, no camera logs. Her parents confirmed she arrived late that night, but admitted they hadn't stayed up to greet her. There was nothing to prove when she got there. When asked about Ariel's behavior leading up to the disappearance, Naomi hesitated. She said Ariel had become closed off and had been pulling away from everyone. When pressed, she refused to speculate further. She ended the interview early, stating she had nothing more to offer. Then there was the ex, Colin Maris. He and Ariel had been together for nearly 3 years before their quiet breakup 8 months prior. According to him, they parted on neutral terms. No arguments, no cheating, just drift. When detectives reached out, Colin said they hadn't spoken in weeks and that he had moved on, even seeing someone new. But when they pulled Ariel's phone records, 2 outgoing calls had been made to Colin's number the day she disappeared. One in the morning, one in the early evening. He hadn't mentioned it either. When confronted, he said he hadn't picked up, claimed he didn't even notice the missed calls until days later. He said he didn't want to make himself look suspicious. His story didn't sit well with investigators. His social media had no activity that night, and the location data from his phone placed him at home, alone, watching TV. There was no one to confirm it. Detectives also spoke to Julian Roth, the tech investor who had recently funded Ariel's upcoming fall collection. He'd put in nearly $50,000 over the previous 6 months, structuring it as an informal business agreement. He called it a handshake with teeth. Roth was dismissive during his interview, irritated even, said Ariel had stopped answering his calls and gone silent weeks earlier. He claimed he'd been close to pulling out of the deal altogether. She said she had ghosted him and acted increasingly erratic. When asked about her work, he admitted he had seen only early drafts of her line and hadn't received the promised samples. When detectives inquired about the possibility of a financial dispute, Roth denied it. But behind closed doors, he'd already begun threatening legal action against her estate to reclaim his investment. When asked if he knew about the missing sketchbook, his tone changed. He paused, then said, "She was very protective of that. Wouldn't let anyone near it. I figured it was all in her head." And then there was Caroline Voss, Ariel's older sister, living just an hour away in Mesa. She hadn't been contacted during the initial missing persons filing and was only brought in after police reviewed Ariel's emergency contact records. The two hadn't spoken in over a sour year. Caroline described their relationship as strained, citing years of unresolved resentment tied to their parents' passing and Ariel's career-first mindset. Still, she'd followed her sister's progress from afar. When told about the disappearance, Caroline didn't cry. Instead, she asked one question. "Did you check the sketchbook?" She said Ariel always used her design notebooks like journals, that when she was anxious or scared, she'd draw it out rather than write it down. Caroline offered to help, but the estrangement made detectives cautious. She hadn't been part of Ariel's life for some time. She offered no motive, but also no alibi. As investigators built out the timeline, a new pattern emerged: whispers within the fashion industry. There had been tension surrounding Ariel's designs, specifically rumors that another independent designer had released a suspiciously similar collection earlier that year. Word had circulated that Ariel believed her concepts had been stolen, possibly by someone close to her. When asked if she'd filed any kind of legal complaint or copyright claim, her attorney said no. She talked about it vaguely, but never acted. Her friends confirmed she'd become consumed by the idea that someone was watching her work, but none of them knew who she suspected. And if she had written anything down, it would have been in the sketchbook, which still hadn't been found. No one in her inner circle had answers. No one had proof. No one could confirm or deny her state of mind with certainty. Some believed she had cracked under pressure. Others suspected foul play. But as days passed without developments, the question shifted. It wasn't just about who knew Ariel. It became about who thought they knew her, and what they may have done when they realized they didn't. Then, 86 days after Ariel vanished, police received a tip about an unrelated case, one that led them to pull surveillance footage from a residential alley on the other side of the city. What they found wasn't a person, but something far more disturbing: a single page, partially burnt, still bearing her name. By the 1-year mark, the air around Ariel Voss's case had gone still. There had been no new footage, no new tips, nobody, no answers. Detectives off the record began calling it what they hadn't dared to before: a cold case. Officially, the investigation remained open. Unofficially, it was treading water. Ariel's photo, once shared across headlines, was no longer featured. The case was replaced by newer stories, more recent disappearances, fresh tragedies. Public attention moved on. But for the people who knew her, or thought they had, that kind of forgetting felt unbearable. Her apartment lease was eventually terminated. The building's management held her belongings for months before turning them over to her sister. Caroline collected every box herself and loaded it into her car in silence. She didn't cry. Not there. But inside those boxes, wrapped samples, color swatches, broken pencils, she started noticing details that hadn't been reported. Notes in the margins of old sketchbooks, frantic scribbles beside fabric types she hadn't used in years. One line caught her attention. "If I disappear, it's not because I wanted to." It wasn't dated, and it was written in all caps, wedged between measurements for a coat. No one could prove when she'd written it or what it referred to. But for Caroline, it was enough to shift from grieving sister to investigator. She quit her job 2 weeks later and moved into a smaller apartment to free up time. Over the next few months, she built a digital archive of everything connected to Ariel: texts, emails, social media posts, screenshots, and early design drafts. She combed public records, dug into Ariel's former contacts, tracked the movements of people who'd last spoken to her. She couldn't let it go, not while the police had. Meanwhile, the people closest to Ariel had drifted in opposite directions. Naomi, the assistant who had once seemed inseparable from Ariel's day-to-day life, left the fashion world entirely. In an online post that was quickly deleted, she mentioned feeling burnt out, guilty, and done pretending it's okay. Her LinkedIn profile went blank not long after. Colin, the ex-boyfriend, got married to a woman he'd met 6 months after Ariel vanished. Friends said he never talked about the case. When asked about it by a reporter once, he gave a short reply. "I hope she's at peace, wherever she is." He didn't elaborate, but while the inner circle fell silent, the internet hadn't forgotten. A subreddit dedicated to missing persons began tracking Ariel's case in obsessive detail. Armchair detectives parsed through every publicly available file, photo, and interview. They mapped her last known movements, cataloged overlapping disappearances, and even analyzed her design motifs for potential coded messages, theories the police quickly dismissed. But one post gained traction after being shared more than 2,000 times. It compared Ariel's case to a string of other disappearances involving creative professionals, mostly women, mostly working alone. The post claimed these weren't isolated incidents, that they followed a disturbing pattern: no violence, no bodies, just clean vanishings, often after reports of stalking, digital theft, or intellectual property disputes. The thread suggested a darker possibility: trafficking. The theory was thin. There was no direct evidence tying Ariel's case to a trafficking ring, no activity on the dark web, no ransom demands, no proof she'd crossed any border. But the complete absence of physical evidence, not even a discarded shoe, strand of hair, or partial fingerprint, unsettled people. The comment section is filled with speculation. Some claimed Ariel had likely been surveilled. Others believed she may have been forced into silence, her disappearance staged to erase her work. A few argued that the theory gave false hope, that by now the likelier answer was death. Detectives monitored the threads but issued no public response. Privately, they admitted they had no evidence to support the theory, but no way to disprove it either. It lingered, like static in the background of the case, never loud enough to take over, but never quite going away. Months dragged on. The sketchbook never resurfaced. The burnt fiber paper fragment found in an alley months earlier was logged, tested, and stored. Its fibers matched the brand Ariel was known to use. The ink was hers. But the page was too far gone to recover any complete image. Just the corner of a dress hem and the letters AV in smudged graphite. No fingerprints, no DNA. The trash around it had already been collected. Whoever had tried to destroy it had done so carefully, and just recently. The page wasn't weathered. It hadn't been sitting outside for long. That burnt sketch became the only new clue in a case that had gone silent. It reopened the wound, reignited the conversation, and pushed Caroline further into her private search. She started emailing retired detectives, paid for public records access, and began cross-referencing Ariel's last known contacts with other people in the fashion industry, looking for repeat names, familiar faces, and unexplained coincidences. She found something. A detail that hadn't been considered, not a person, but a design. A coat, released by a new designer from Los Angeles. It bore an uncanny resemblance to a piece Ariel had sketched 6 months before she disappeared. It wasn't proof. Not yet. But it was enough to keep her looking. And then, just before the second anniversary of Ariel's disappearance, someone tried to get rid of something else. This time, it wasn't just a sketch. It was a whole page, singed around the edges, hidden under trash, and still partially intact. 2 years after Ariel Voss vanished without a trace, the last place anyone expected the case to stir again was a narrow residential alley 30 miles from Phoenix. Early on a Sunday morning, a retired mechanic named Dan Whaley took his dog out, following a route he'd walked 100 times. He was the kind of man who didn't look for trouble and didn't talk much. But that morning, something caught his eye, a faint column of smoke rising from a shallow pile of trash bags behind a chain-link fence. He might have walked past it, except for the smell. Not the sharp bite of burning plastic, but paper. Thick, quality paper. Dan got closer. The pile was still smoldering, the embers low but not cold. As he nudged the edge of the blackened pile with his boot, something curled outward from the char. A sheet, half burnt, taped at the top like it had once been part of a larger set. The lower corner was signed. A V. The letters were faint but unmistakable. He didn't recognize them then, just that the paper didn't belong in the trash. He picked it up, let it dry in the sun as best he could, and brought it home, unsure why. Later that evening, his daughter, visiting for the weekend, saw the initials and froze. She remembered the case, the sketches, the woman who had never been found. The sheet was turned over to the police the next day. When detectives arrived, they were cautious. After 2 years of silence, the idea that a new clue would just appear randomly was hard to believe. But forensics didn't lie. The ink was fresh. The paper had not been exposed to the elements long. More importantly, the signature matched prior samples of Ariel's handwriting. Experts confirmed it was real, not copied, not forged. This wasn't a prank. Someone had kept it hidden all this time, and then, deliberately, tried to destroy it. Detectives examined the alley. There were no security cameras, no nearby businesses, just rows of quiet homes and garages, none of which reported anything suspicious. No strange cars, no late-night visitors, nothing that pointed to who had left the sketch or why they'd chosen to burn it now, after years of silence. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood and knocked on doors. Only one resident recalled anything unusual: a white sedan idling behind the alley late the night before. No license plate, no clear view of the driver, just a shadow. The sketch itself was incomplete but unmistakable in style. Ariel's designs had always leaned towards sharp, bold silhouettes and aggressive lines. This one followed suit. The dress was asymmetrical, angular, and unfinished at the hem. The torso showed careful shading, the kind she usually used just before moving to fabric. It was part of the line she'd spoken about to close friends, the one she canceled days before she vanished. The same line was contained in her missing sketchbook, which had never been found. Until now. For the investigators who'd long assumed the book was gone forever, likely destroyed early in the disappearance, this changed everything. It suggested that someone had held on to at least part of it, hidden it, protected it, and then, for reasons unknown, they decided to get rid of it in a fire. Not just discarded, destroyed. The act felt personal, urgent, as though the page had suddenly become dangerous to possess. The question was why? And why now? Detectives reopened the original suspect list. Ariel's ex-boyfriend had since moved out of state, but phone records showed no recent ties to the Phoenix area. The assistant who had left the fashion world hadn't resurfaced. Her former investor, now entangled in several lawsuits, had declared bankruptcy. Police checked shipping records, emails, printer logs, any digital trail that might indicate if Ariel's sketches had been copied, sold, or leaked. Nothing turned up. But something had changed. Carolyn, Ariel's sister, believed the sketch was part of the collection she'd seen notes about. In one notebook, Ariel had labeled it December 17th, Showstopper. That design was never released. If the page was legitimate, and forensics said it was, someone had sat on it for 2 years, Possibly more pages, maybe the entire sketchbook, which raised an even darker question: who had access to it in the first place? The only way someone could have had it was if they took it, or found it soon after Ariel disappeared. And if they'd found it, why hadn't they turned it in? Online communities reignited. Reddit threads exploded with new theories. Some believed this proved Ariel had been abducted by someone in the industry, someone who admired or envied her work. Others suggested the person who burnt the sketch had panicked, either after hearing renewed whispers about the case or fearing exposure. One theory floated the idea that the sketchbook had changed hands, that it had been sold, passed around in secret, and whoever had it now realized they were holding evidence. Detectives didn't confirm or deny any of the speculation, but internally, they acknowledged a chilling possibility. The sketch may not have been all the person had. It may have just been the first to surface, or the first time they couldn't hide anymore. No other pages were found in the alley. No cameras had caught the drop. But someone, somewhere, had made a decision. To burn it. To destroy a part of the last thing Ariel had ever created. And they almost succeeded. Almost. The discovery of the burnt sketch reignited something in Caroline that had gone quiet over the last year. Urgency. For months, she'd oscillated between grieving the unknown and trying to keep her sister's name from disappearing completely. But the sketch changed that. It proved Ariel had created something real, something someone wanted erased, and Caroline wasn't willing to let it vanish a second time. She started digging through Ariel's cloud backups, files she hadn't touched in over a year, old design, PDFs, mood boards, and garment drafts. Many were half-finished, but one folder stood out, L12 Black Line. Caroline remembered the name. It was what Ariel had scribbled in her notebook the week before she vanished, the collection that never launched. Inside were 12 designs, most labeled with strange shorthand codes only Ariel would have understood. One, titled 1217 Final, stopped Caroline cold. The pose, the shape, the angled torso. It was unmistakably the same design as the half-burnt sketch, but the details were different. Ariel's version had softer lines at the waist, more complexity in the fabric folds. The burnt version had been altered, subtly but deliberately. It raised a terrifying possibility. Someone had taken Ariel's work, changed it just enough to pass as theirs, and sat on it for months, maybe longer. Caroline began comparing each file in the folder to recent collections she could find online. Fashion blogs, boutique catalogs, runway recaps. Then, buried in an archived video from an LA showcase nearly a year and a half after Ariel's disappearance, she saw it. The same silhouette, the same asymmetric cut. A model is turning slowly in a showroom lined with minimalist concrete walls. The collection was called Reclamation. The designer's name is Morgan Vale. On paper, Vale had no connection to Ariel. She was new to the LA scene, branded as self-taught and gaining popularity through social media. Her work had been praised for its bold originality, but Caroline didn't believe in coincidences anymore. She ordered swatches, promotional lookbooks, and anything she could get her hands on. 5 designs in Morgan Vale's collection bore unmistakable resemblances to Ariel's unreleased work. Not duplicates, but echoes. Pieces of the same origin filtered through a different hand. Caroline printed them all, laid them out beside Ariel's digital drafts, and circled the overlaps. It was uncatalogued. Caroline brought her findings to detectives who looped in a forensic design analyst, a niche expert often used in copyright disputes. The analyst confirmed that while the collections weren't exact matches, the probability of 5 garments having that degree of stylistic overlap, with similar structural signatures and details, was statistically improbable. Too close for chance. It strongly suggests derivation. When police reached out to Morgan Vale, she denied ever hearing of Ariel Voss. She claimed her collection had been developed over a year, inspired by emotional healing. But under scrutiny, a detail emerged that changed everything. One of her junior pattern makers, a man named Eliseo Hart, had interned in Phoenix 2 years prior for a local designer who operated out of a shared workspace downtown. That designer had been Ariel. At the time, Hart was fresh out of school, quiet, observant, not particularly notable. But he'd worked in the studio during the same month Ariel had been developing the L12 Blackline collection. When contacted, Hart didn't deny the connection. He was admitted to the internship and even recalled helping with fabric samples and digital scanning. But when asked directly whether he had copied or retained any of Ariel's designs, he claimed he didn't remember. "I moved on," he told them. "That was a long time ago." The LA firm refused to hand over his laptop without a warrant, and detectives didn't have enough evidence for one. The investigation stalled. Still, Caroline couldn't let it go. She kept pushing. She found anonymous posts from design forums discussing repurposed sketches and whispering about young creatives taking inspiration from dead projects. It wasn't illegal, not unless something tangible could prove theft. But to Caroline, this wasn't about legality. It was about Ariel's legacy. Someone had stolen her voice and turned it into profit. The burnt sketch wasn't just trash. It was a silencing, an attempt to erase proof of the original. And the fact that it was nearly successful haunted her. Without Dan's dog walk that morning, it would have all gone up in smoke. The narrative would have belonged to someone else. Detectives quietly reopened inquiries around the LA studio. They couldn't charge anyone. But they wanted to know who had access to the files, who had connections to Phoenix, and who had a motive. Hart quietly resigned 2 months later. Morganvale's studio went silent online shortly after. Publicly, there was no scandal. But the designs stopped appearing. No new collections, no follow-up showcases. It was like the entire brand had been paused. Caroline released Ariel's original designs online, under her name. She included timestamps, digital metadata, and even sketches with hand-noted stitching instructions. The fashion world noticed. Small publications began to re-examine Ariel's disappearance through the lens of stolen work. Blogs speculated, theories reignited. But no formal charges were filed. To this day, Caroline doesn't know how many of Ariel's ideas made it out of that studio, or how many more are still out there, buried under different names. But what she does know is this: someone tried to burn her sister's legacy. And for a moment, it almost worked. The tip line had been quiet for months, just the usual: false leads, vague sightings, and people mistaking her for someone else at a gas station in Nevada or a mall in Albuquerque. After 2 years, even the investigators had stopped hoping for anything useful to come from it, until one call changed that. It came in just after 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. The dispatcher almost didn't answer in time. On the line, a blocked number. No caller ID, no traceable metadata, just a low, muffled voice, male, distorted. It was almost a whisper, barely audible through the static. Only one sentence came through clearly. "She's not where you think. Look by the water, under the pipe." Then, nothing. The line cut. Investigators moved fast. The message was specific enough to narrow it down. By the water, under the pipe. Combined with the call's cell tower range, it led them to an industrial stretch on the outskirts of Tempe, near an old storm runoff system that fed into a dried creek bed. The area wasn't monitored. No cameras, no foot traffic. Just cracked concrete, tall grass, and rows of rusted storm drains, most of which hadn't seen water in years. They brought in dogs. First search dogs, but they found nothing. No human scent trail, no disturbed earth. Then they brought cadaver dogs. And that's when things shifted. One of the dogs alerted at a specific pipe. It was half submerged and wide enough for someone to crawl into, though barely. Crews opened it cautiously. Inside was mostly debris, wet leaves, broken glass, silt. But buried beneath that is fabric. Tattered, water-damaged. Several scraps clumped together, some wrapped in old twine. Most were too deteriorated to identify, but one still held ink. Black marker, bled from moisture, but still legible. In the bottom corner, A.V. The fabric was sent to the lab immediately. Ariel had been known to sign her mock-ups, especially ones she intended to finalize. The ink matched, the fabric type matched, and more importantly, embedded within the fibers, under layers of sediment and degradation, was biological matter. Skin cells. Not fresh, but recoverable. The DNA profile was clear. It was Ariel's. For her family, the news brought a wave of conflicting emotions. It wasn't closure. There was nobody. No clear timeline. But it was proof. She had been there. At some point, for some reason, Ariel Voss had been beneath that pipe. Whether alive or dead, no one could say for sure. But her physical presence in that place couldn't be denied. And that meant everything that had happened since, the burnt sketch, the copied designs, the silence, was all tethered to something real. A location. A moment. A decision. Police searched the area for days after the discovery. They dug into the drainage system, sifted through runoff maps, and traced how the water might have carried materials from other parts of the city. But nothing else turned up. Nobody. No blood, no personal effects. Just the fabric, buried deep in a pipe no one had touched in years. The call was replayed dozens of times. Analysts attempted to isolate the voice and compare it to known persons of interest, but the distortion was too severe. There was no digital fingerprint, no traceable VoIP data, and no way to confirm who placed it. It had been routed through a VPN, likely from a burner device. Whoever made the call knew what they were doing. The timing also raised questions. Why now? Why wait 2 years? And why not say more? Theories spiraled online. Some believed the caller had been directly involved and was trying to distance himself from the crime, giving just enough information to feel absolved, but not enough to be caught. Others thought he might have found something, or someone, and was afraid to come forward openly. A few even believed it was staged, a distraction, a message. Carolyn didn't know what to believe anymore. All she knew was that her sister had been in that pipe. Maybe not long. Maybe someone left those scraps there as a warning. Or maybe Ariel had left them herself, trying to leave a trail no one found in time. The thought haunted her. The idea that Ariel might have been alive, trying to send some kind of signal, only to be buried in silence again. Investigators revisited old suspects and re-interviewed people they hadn't spoken to since the early weeks. The ex-boyfriend had moved out of state. The assistant stopped responding to calls. The investor who once claimed Ariel had ghosted him had gone underground. His business had dissolved a year earlier. None of them had alibis solid enough to eliminate suspicion. And now, with physical evidence found, and no explanation, the weight of their earlier statements was suddenly being re-evaluated. But there was no smoking gun, just scraps. The case remained open, technically active, but nothing moved. No new calls, no new evidence, just a dead phone line and a storm pipe that now held more questions than answers. For Caroline, that silence was the loudest part, because someone had made a choice to burn the sketch, to hide the fabric, to call, then disappear, which meant someone still knew more than they were saying. And somewhere, out there, that person was still watching. With no body, no suspect, and no verified sighting, detectives began to drift into uncomfortable territory. Theory. Not the kind that leads to arrests or convictions, but the kind that fills the vacuum when facts stop coming. Internally, the department is divided. Dead. Some clung to the idea of a targeted abduction. Others whispered darker possibilities behind closed doors. And then there were the ones who, reluctantly, began to ask whether Ariel Voss had orchestrated her disappearance. The burnt sketch, the recovered fabrics, the anonymous call, they were evidence, yes, but evidence of what? A crime, a cover-up, or something stranger? None of it aligned into a coherent narrative. That's when investigators started to look not just at the last things Ariel made, but at how she thought. Her sketchbooks, collected from her studio and apartment, had previously been cataloged, scanned, and filed away. But now they were reviewed again, page by page, not for designs but for patterns, notes in the margins, scribbles, signs of distress. And there it was, buried in the back of one leather-bound sketchbook. A single phrase repeated several times between pencil marks and fabric swatches. They want what I see, not me. It was written in 3 places with slight variations. It didn't name anyone. It didn't accuse. But it raised a chilling question. Had someone been threatening her, Trying to control her work? Or was it the product of anxiety, something internal that had grown louder as her career took off? A subpoena led to the release of a sealed report from a licensed therapist in Phoenix. Ariel had been seeing her on and off in the months before she vanished. According to the notes, Ariel had begun expressing fears that someone was following her. She'd mentioned seeing the same car parked outside her studio multiple times. She said she'd started covering her windows and avoiding routine places. At one point, she asked the therapist if being paranoid could also mean being right. The therapist had reportedly urged her to document these feelings and to speak to law enforcement, but Ariel refused. She said she didn't want to be labeled unstable, especially not in her industry. That revelation changed the tone of the investigation. Suddenly, Ariel's behavior in the weeks leading up to her disappearance looked different. Her canceled appointments, her brief vague text to her sister, her decision to switch phones just days before she vanished, a move previously assumed to be for work reasons. Maybe they were signs of fear, not distraction. Maybe she'd felt cornered and didn't know how to say it out loud. At the same time, a second theory emerged, more disturbing and even less provable. What if Ariel had been forced into silence, that someone had taken her not to harm her, but to extract her work, to steal the very thing that made her valuable? It would explain the timing of the burnt sketch and the copied fashion line. If she had been held somewhere, pressured to produce designs under duress, that would make her both a victim and a source of profit. But why release evidence now? Why draw attention back to a case that had nearly faded? Online sleuths speculated that whoever had her, if she'd been alive during that time, might have feared discovery, or that something went wrong and they needed to erase the last traces. The anonymous call became central to this theory. If Ariel had been held, maybe she would have escaped. Maybe she left clues before she vanished again. Or maybe someone who knew about her captivity finally broke, too late to help. But the third theory, though least favored by law enforcement, refused to die online, that Ariel had staged her disappearance, not out of selfishness, but out of desperation. That she'd been so scared or so disillusioned or so betrayed that she chose to vanish and let the world think otherwise. Supporters of this theory pointed to her silence in therapy, her growing paranoia, and the absence of any struggle at the parking lot where she was last seen. No broken glass, no screams, no evidence of force. But that theory had one major flaw. Why leave behind fragments? The sketch, the signature, the fabric. If she wanted to disappear completely, why drop breadcrumbs? Caroline refused to believe it. She said her sister was many things, private, intense, driven, but she would never disappear without telling her. Not voluntarily. Not like that. Detectives tried to reconcile the contradictory evidence. Each theory seemed plausible in isolation, but they couldn't coexist. And none answered the central question. Where was she now? If she were taken, why hadn't a ransom ever come? If she ran, why did the trail only reappear 2 years later? If she had died, why was there no body, no trace, and no confirmed time of death? The only thing everyone agreed on was that Ariel had left something behind, intentionally or not, that suggested she knew she was in danger, and the phrase scrawled in her sketchbook erasure led the room where it had been read aloud. They want what I see, not me. Was it fear, a warning, or the beginning of a plan? Whatever the answer, investigators were now looking not just for a missing person, but for the full truth behind what had started as a disappearance, and now looked more like a calculated erasure. Person, but. And 6 months after the burnt sketch was found smoldering in a Phoenix alley, another envelope arrived. No return address, no name. Just a plain white envelope slid through the mail slot of Caroline Voss's front door on a Wednesday morning in March. It was thin, light enough to feel empty, but inside was a single piece of muslin fabric, rough around the edges, and sewn into it with deliberate care was one strand of deep crimson thread. No message, no explanation, just the thread, like a stitch without a garment, a hint without a voice. At first, Caroline didn't understand what she was looking at. She thought it might be a prank or a cruel reminder from someone trying to stir up attention. But something about the fabric, the way it was folded, the way the stitch was placed, off-center but intentional, felt too purposeful to ignore. She drove it straight to the lead investigator on Ariel's case, who handed it off to the lab without hesitation. The forensic team found no fingerprints, but on the inner fold of the fabric, right where the crimson thread met the muslin, they detected skin oil, trace enough to hold partial DNA. It didn't match Ariel, it didn't match anyone in the family. But after 2 weeks of cross-referencing with previous persons of interest and known associates, the lab came back with a hit. The partial DNA aligned with a former intern who had once worked under Ariel, a woman named Lena Hart, who had later joined the team of the Los Angeles designer whose collection bore eerie similarities to Ariel's unreleased line. When detectives approached Lena at her West Hollywood apartment, she denied knowing anything about the muslin or the envelope. She said she hadn't been to Phoenix in over 2 years and hadn't spoken to Ariel since before she vanished, and that she had no idea what they were talking about. But when police obtained a warrant to search her digital accounts, everything began to unravel. Buried inside a deleted folder in her cloud storage, hidden behind layers of renamed files and timestamps that had been digitally altered, they found a collection of sketches, 17 in total. All signed AV All with metadata indicating they had been created weeks, not months, after Ariel's disappearance. The style was unmistakable. Anyone who had studied Ariel's work knew her flourishes, her ink pressure, and the balance she used between clean edges and sharp angles. These weren't copies. These were originals. Work she'd continued to create after the world assumed she was gone. That discovery reframed everything. If the sketches were real, and verified experts confirmed that they were, then Ariel hadn't vanished into silence, at least not right away. She had been somewhere, working, creating, leaving behind a trail that someone had chosen to bury. When confronted again, Lena refused to answer any questions. She lawyered up and stopped cooperating entirely. But with the recovered files, the DNA trace, and her proximity to both the stolen designs and the LA fashion line, police had enough to make an arrest. Lena Hart was taken into custody on charges related to obstruction of justice and possession of stolen intellectual property. But the one question investigators cared about most, where is Ariel, remained unanswered. Even under pressure, Lena never revealed who had sent the envelope or where the red thread had come from. She never explained how she had those sketches or why she'd hidden them. She never said whether Ariel was dead or alive. She only said, "You can't prove what didn't happen," before her attorney shut the interview down. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even a denial. It was a wall, one, red, that seemed designed to hold something darker behind it. The thread became symbolic in the media, red for blood, for warning, for unresolved tension. But in forensic terms, it was only fabric. The muslin was the kind Ariel often used in early drafts. She had once told a friend that real design always started in muslin because you could feel its flaws. You couldn't hide imperfections. If the thread had come from her studio, it was long gone now. Her workspace had been rented out to a new tenant the year before, and no usable evidence remained. In the weeks that followed Lena's arrest, police tried to build a broader case. They looked into her communications, her travels, and her financials. But if she had been paid to keep quiet or had worked under someone else's direction, they found no proof. Whoever was behind the wider orchestration, if there was anyone else, had cleaned their tracks well. Lena became the focal point, not the key. She had access, yes, motive maybe, but the final answers stayed just out of reach. And still, nobody. No confirmed sighting, no surveillance footage, no confession, just that one envelope, that single thread, the sketches that weren't supposed to exist, and the sense, growing louder now, that Ariel Voss's disappearance had never been random, that somewhere in the silence, someone was still watching, or remembering. Because if she had lived past the night she vanished, even for a few weeks, it meant she had either tried to survive and failed, or someone had made sure her voice would never be heard again. And yet, in that muslin scrap, sewn with that one crimson line, her voice found a way to return, even if it was just a whisper.